A sharp cry cut through the fog of that chilly morning, and what happened next would forever change the life of a small rural village. You won't believe how a simple calf became the unlikely hero of this story of courage and redemption. Like, comment, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one that prove the strongest bonds are forged in the darkest moments. The fog danced across the fields like forgotten ghosts, and it was then that Mary heard for the first time the sound that would freeze any heart. It wasn't the usual mooing of cattle at dawn, nor the wind whispering secrets among the eucalyptus leaves. It was a lament, deep and drawn out, that seemed to carry the weight of all the world's sorrow. Mary stopped in the middle of the dirt, rode her fingers instinctively tightening around the handle of the wicker basket she carried. The humid morning air filled her lungs like ice needles, but it wasn't the cold that made her body tremble. It was the inexplicable certainty that the sound was a cry for help. It had been 3 months since Mary had left the big city behind, trading the gray concrete for those rolling fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The small brick house she had rented was on the edge of St. Mary's Village, a place where time seemed to have decided to walk slower. People still greeted each other on the cobblestone streets, children played barefoot on warm afternoons, and secrets were kept with the same devotion as family recipes. Mary was looking for exactly that. The silence that would allow her to hear her own thoughts after years of being suffocated by the noise of the metropolis. But silence, she would discover, sometimes screams louder than any noise. The lament echoed again, and this time Mary realized it was coming from the direction of the old Miller farm. The property was isolated on the western edge of the village, separated from the other houses by a dirt road that snaked between hills covered in tall grass. Mary only knew the place from sight. She had passed by a few times on her morning walks, always noticing how the wooden fences seemed too tired to stand, as if abandonment itself had physical weight. The farmer, John Miller, was a figure who inspired more pity than fear in the community. A man with stooped shoulders and a gaze always fixed on the ground, as if searching for something lost a long time ago. Mary followed the sound like a moth follows a light, her steps creating small puddles in the dewy grass. The path to the farm was lined with oaks shedding their last leaves, creating a golden carpet on the red earth. The contrast between the melancholic beauty of nature and the anguish of that sound created a dissonance that tightened her chest. As she drew closer, the lament gained texture, transforming from a distant echo into a physical presence that seemed to vibrate in the humid air. Mary could feel the suffering as if it were a living entity, breathing heavily among the hills. The Miller farm first appeared as a blurred silhouette through the fog. The main house, once imposing with its whitewashed walls, now displayed moisture stains that ran down like petrified tears. The old tiles, many broken or out of place, allowed rain to invade the upper rooms. Mary could see through the windowless windows that nature had already begun to reclaim the space, with vines snaking through the interior walls. But it wasn't the house that caught her attention. It was the corral in the back, from where the lament came. Mary cautiously approached, using a trail between the trees that allowed her to observe without being seen. Years of city life had taught her the importance of discretion, especially when it came to other people's affairs. But when her eyes finally found the source of the suffering, all caution evaporated like dew in the sun. In the muddy enclosure, a cow lay on its side, its labored breathing creating small clouds of vapor in the cold air. The animal was visibly sick, its ribs prominent under the mud-stained hide, its eyes glazed with fever. But what broke Mary's heart was the small calf nestled against its mother's body. The calf couldn't have been more than a few days old, maybe a week at most. Its reddish-brown fur still retained the softness characteristic of newborns, but its movements already showed a desperate urgency. The calf tried to suckle, pushing its muzzle against its mother's udder, but the cow barely had the strength to lift her head, let alone feed her offspring. The lament Mary had heard came from both, mother and child united in a duet of despair that echoed through the fields like a death knell. That's when Mary saw John Miller. The farmer appeared on the other side of the corral, carrying a bucket that he dropped with a thud upon seeing the state of the animals. For a moment, Mary waited for him to rush to help, to show some sign of concern. But John just stood there, his shoulders even more stooped, as if the weight of the situation had been added to all the other invisible burdens he carried. He muttered something inaudible, shook his head, and turned his back on the animals, walking back to the house with dragging steps. Mary felt anger rise like bile in her throat. How could someone simply turn their back on such suffering? Her fists clenched involuntarily, her nails digging crescents into her palms. But the anger soon gave way to a more complex internal conflict. Who was she to judge? An outsider who barely knew the people or the local customs. Maybe there was more to the story than her urban eyes could see. Maybe John was as broken as his animals, unable to offer care because he didn't receive it himself. The calf, in a movement that defied its young age, managed to stand. Its wobbly legs trembled with the effort, but there was a determination in its movements that touched Mary deeply. The calf walked unsteadily to the fence and, to Mary's surprise, fixed its large brown eyes directly on her, as if it knew it was being watched. There was no fear in that gaze, only a disturbing intelligence and a silent plea that transcended the barrier between species. Mary involuntarily took a step back, but the calf followed her movement, pressing its muzzle between the wooden slats of the fence. A soft moo escaped its small throat, different from the previous lament. It was almost as if it was trying to communicate, to establish a connection. Mary hesitantly extended her hand, and when her fingers touched the soft fur of the animal's forehead, she felt an electric current of mutual understanding. The calf closed its eyes for a moment, leaning against her touch as if that small gesture of affection were the first kindness it had experienced in its short life. In the days that followed, Mary returned to the farm as if fulfilling a sacred ritual. Always in the early morning hours, when the fog still embraced the fields and John slept his restless sleep, she brought fresh hay that she bought with her savings, clean water in bottles that she hid in her backpack, and a nutritious paste that she had learned to make with Mrs. Concepcion, the retired veterinarian who lived in the center of the village. The calf always waited for her by the fence, as if it had memorized the sound of her steps on the damp earth. The cow, whom Mary had silently named Hope, showed timid signs of improvement. Her eyes had regained some of their shine, and she could lift her head when her calf approached. But progress was slow, painfully slow, and Mary knew she needed more than clandestine care. The situation required professional intervention, appropriate medication, and above all, John's cooperation. But how to approach a man who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders? The opportunity arose on a Saturday afternoon when Mary found John in the small village market. He was standing in front of the feed aisle, his fingers tapping nervously in his empty pocket. Mary took a deep breath, adjusted her courage as if adjusting a dress, and approached. The conversation began with pleasantries about the weather, the harvest, the prices. Mary chose her words as if walking on a minefield, trying to build a bridge before crossing it. When she finally mentioned having seen the animals during a walk, John's face closed like a door slammed by the wind. The lines around his eyes deepened, and his voice came out hoarse like rust. He talked about how the farm was the pride of the family, how his father and grandfather had built everything with their own hands. He talked about the drought 3 years ago that decimated the herd, about the debts that accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river. He talked about his wife, Rose, who had left with the children when he refused to sell the land to pay off the debts. Each word was a shard of glass that cut as it was spoken. Mary listened in silence, her heart tightening with each revelation. When John finished, she gently suggested that she knew someone who could help with the animals, perhaps a partnership agreement. But it was like lighting a match near gasoline. John exploded in a rage that seemed more like despair, accusing her of being another outsider, trying to meddle where she wasn't called. His words were hard as stones, and Mary recoiled, biting her tongue to avoid retaliating. She saw in his eyes not only anger, but fear. Fear of losing the last thread that connected him to the past, fear of admitting that he needed help. Tension at the farm escalated in the following weeks. Mary continued her secret visits, but now she knew that John was aware of her presence. Sometimes she saw him watching from a window of the main house, his face an impenetrable mask. The calf, which Mary had begun to call Courage, developed increasingly elaborate ways of communicating. It mooed in specific patterns when she arrived, different from the sounds it made when it was hungry or when it tried to stimulate its mother to get up. It was on a particularly cold morning that Mary witnessed something extraordinary. Hope had worsened overnight, her breathing becoming increasingly shallow. Courage, instead of moving away as would be natural for such a young animal, positioned itself between its mother and the fence as if creating a protective barrier. When John appeared carrying what looked like a rope, the calf didn't move. On the contrary, it raised its small head and stared at the farmer with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a young creature. Mary held her breath, her body tense like a violin string about to snap. She saw John hesitate, the rope trembling in his calloused hands. The moment stretched like caramel in the fire, each second an eternity of possibilities. It was then that Courage did something that would change everything. The little calf walked slowly to John and, with infinite gentleness, touched the man's knee with its muzzle. A gesture so simple, so pure, that it seemed to pierce all layers of bitterness and wounded pride. John fell to his knees in the mud, his hands covering his face as silent sobs shook his shoulders. Mary had never seen a man cry like that, as if years of pent-up tears had finally found an outlet. Courage remained there, its small, warm body pressed against the farmer, offering comfort that needed no words. It was at that moment that Mary knew it was time to act decisively. She emerged from her hiding place and walked slowly to the corral. John looked up with red eyes, but there was no more anger in them, only exhaustion. Mary said nothing, only knelt beside him in the cold mud. They stayed there, the three of them, united by a moment of shared vulnerability. It was John who broke the silence, his voice hoarse like dry branches. He told about the sleepless nights, about how he saw his father's ghost in every corner of the farm, disappointed with what his son had allowed to happen. He talked about Rose's letters that he hadn't had the courage to open, about the children who would barely recognize their father if they saw him now. Mary listened, and when he finished, she told her own story, about the divorce that had left her without a foundation, about the job in the city that sucked her soul drop by drop, about the decision to start over in a place where she could breathe. She talked about how Hope's lament had touched her because she recognized that sound. It was the same one that echoed in her own chest on lonely nights. She talked about Courage and how the calf's determination had renewed her own faith in the possibility of better days. While they talked, Courage had returned to its mother's side, trying once more to encourage her to get up. The sun began to break through the clouds, painting the corral with golden hues that made the mud seem less gloomy. It was then that Mary proposed something that would change the course of everyone there. She knew people in the village, good people who understood the value of land and tradition, people who could help not out of pity, but out of respect for the legacy that the farm represented. But she would need John's permission, his willingness to accept that asking for help wasn't weakness, but courage. John was silent for long minutes, his gaze alternating between hope, courage, and Mary. When he finally agreed with an almost imperceptible nod, Mary felt as if a dam had broken in her chest. She stood up, her legs numb from kneeling, and ran to her house. She had phone calls to make, people to mobilize. The village of St. Mary's was about to show what it was capable of when one of its own needed it. The first to answer the call was Mrs. Conception, the retired veterinarian whom Mary had consulted about basic care. The woman with white hair and firm hands arrived in less than an hour, her old pickup truck raising dust on the road. She examined Hope with the efficiency of decades of experience, her lips pressed into a thin line as she auscultated the animal. The diagnosis wasn't the best, advanced pneumonia complicated by severe malnutrition, but Mrs. Concepcion had seen worse cases recover. The important thing was to act quickly. While the veterinarian administered the first medications, other villagers began to arrive. Manuel brought bales of top-quality hay, refusing to accept payment. Mary Garcia appeared with a steaming pot of broth, insisting that John needed to eat to have the strength to care for the animals. The Garcia brothers, known in the region for their skill with wood, immediately began to repair the most deteriorated parts of the fence. It was as if the entire village had been waiting for a signal to show that the community was more than a collection of houses. It was a living organism that cared for its parts. Peter Henry was one of the last to arrive. The agricultural professor from the local technical school was a young man with honey-colored eyes that shone with intelligence and kindness. Mary had met him briefly at an organic produce fair, but it was only now, seeing him roll up his sleeves and join the work without hesitation, that she truly noticed him. There was something in the way he treated the animals, with respect and knowledge, that warmed places in her heart that she thought were permanently frozen. Courage seemed to understand that the tide had turned. The little calf circulated among the people, touching each one with its muzzle as if blessing their presence. When it reached Peter Henry, it did something curious. It gently took the professor's shirt sleeve in its teeth and pulled him towards Mary. Peter laughed, a rich and genuine sound that made Mary blush. The calf released the shirt and mooed contentedly, as if it had accomplished an important mission. Days turned into weeks, and the Miller farm slowly came back to life. Hope responded well to the treatment, her recovery slow but steady. Each small victory was celebrated. The first day she managed to stand on her own. The first time she managed to properly nurse Courage. The first strong moo she let out when she saw the sunrise. John was changing too, the hard lines of his face softening as he accepted the help offered. He began to smile occasionally, a phenomenon so rare that the village children made bets on when it would happen again. Mary and Peter Henry naturally gravitated toward each other during their visits to the farm. Their conversations began technically, about animal nutrition and management techniques, but gradually evolved into more personal territories. Peter shared about his childhood on the farm, about how he had struggled to study and return to help his community. Mary talked about her fears of not fitting in, about how the city had hardened parts of her that were only now beginning to soften again. It was during an afternoon of working together, while building a new watering trough for the animals, that their hands accidentally touched as they reached for the same tool. The moment lasted only a second, but the electricity that passed between them could have illuminated the entire village. Mary recoiled, her heart racing, but Peter gently took her hand, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers. No words were needed. The gesture said everything about possibilities and unspoken promises. The first real test came on a stormy night. The wind howled like hungry wolves, and the rain fell in curtains so dense that it was impossible to see beyond a few meters. Mary woke up to the ringing telephone, John's voice on the other end trembling with panic. Hope had gone into premature labor, complicated by her still fragile condition. Mrs. Concepcion was out of town, and the nearest veterinarian was 2 hours away, too long with the roads in those conditions. Mary didn't hesitate. She dressed quickly, grabbed the emergency kit that Mrs. Concepcion had left for extreme situations, and faced the storm. Peter was already on his way, alerted by John himself. When they arrived at the farm, they found a scene that would forever be etched in their memories. Courage was positioned protectively beside its mother, its small body trembling not from cold, but from concern. Hope was lying on her side, her labored breathing interspersed with moans of pain. The hours that followed tested all limits. Mary, following the instructions she had memorized from Mrs. Concepcion's books, guided John and Peter through the process. The rain drummed on the makeshift roof they had built over the corral, creating a chaotic symphony that mirrored the tension of the moment. Courage never left its mother's side, occasionally touching her with its muzzle as if transmitting strength. It was almost dawn when the new calf was finally born. A small but perfectly formed female. The relief was palpable, a wave that swept over everyone present. Hope, exhausted but triumphant, cleaned her new offspring with an energy that no one would have believed possible weeks before. Courage cautiously approached its sister, sniffing it curiously before giving its approval with a soft moo. Mary felt tears run freely down her face, mixing with the rain that still dripped from the roof. Peter hugged her, and she allowed herself to melt against his chest, feeling for the first time in years that she had found a safe haven. John named the little calf Rebirth, a name that perfectly captured the spirit of transformation that had taken over the farm. In the following weeks, the property became a living symbol of what a united community could achieve. Volunteers continued to appear, bringing not only material help, but stories and laughter that had long ceased to echo within those walls. The main house began to be restored, one tile at a time, one wall at a time. The most touching moment came on a sunny afternoon when an unfamiliar car stopped in front of the farm. Mary was helping to feed the calves when she saw John freeze, the bucket of feed slipping from his hands. A woman and two teenagers, a boy and a girl, got out of the car. Rose had returned, not to demand or reproach, but because news of John's transformation had reached her. The children, initially shy, were soon won over by Courage, who seemed to have a special talent for breaking down barriers. The reconciliation wasn't immediate or easy. There were many wounds to be healed, unspoken words that needed to find a voice. But with the same patience that had saved hope, the family began to rebuild. Rose brought her own skills, transforming part of the farm into a garden that would soon provide vegetables for the entire village. The children, rediscovering their roots, brought a youthful energy that the property hadn't seen in years. Mary observed everything with a mixture of joy and melancholy. Her role as a catalyst had been fulfilled, and part of her wondered if there was still a place for her in this new configuration. It was Peter who noticed her unease during an evening stroll through the now verdant fields. He stopped suddenly, took her hands in his, and with the sincerity she had learned to love, said that the farm had only been the beginning, that he saw in her not only the woman who had saved hope and courage, but the partner with whom he wanted to build something of his own. The proposal came wrapped in simplicity, like everything that was true in that place. Peter offered Mary a small wooden brooch, carved by himself in the shape of a calf. It was rough, the proportions slightly wrong, but there was so much love in each carving that Mary felt her heart overflow. She said yes before he even finished speaking, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of damp earth and infinite possibilities. The Miller farm became the setting for another celebration months later. Mary and Peter's wedding was held under the blossoming oaks, with Courage and Rebirth wearing flower garlands, as unlikely best men. Hope watched everything from the nearby pasture, her serene eyes reflecting the peace that had replaced the suffering. John, unrecognizable in his well-pressed suit, gave the father of the bride speech that Mary never had. His voice choked but firm as he thanked the woman who had brought life back to his land and his family. The party lasted until dawn, with local guitar players playing folk songs that made the older ones remember and the younger ones learn. Mary danced until her feet ached, twirling in Peter's arms while around them, the community celebrated not only a union, but living proof that compassion could transform destinies. At some point in the early morning, she moved away from the noise and walked to the corral where it all had begun. Courage was waiting for her, as if it knew she would come. The calf, now a strong and healthy young bull, approached with the same gentleness as their first meeting. Mary ran her hand through its glossy fur, remembering that trembling calf that had touched her heart with a simple look. Around them, the farm slept peacefully, each animal safe and cared for, each fence repaired, each dream rebuilt. The lament had transformed into song, despair into hope, solitude into community. A year later, Mary was again in the corral, but this time she carried something precious in her arms. Her few months-old daughter slept peacefully, wrapped in a blanket knitted by Mary Garcia. Peter was at her side, a protective arm around his family. Courage approached with the caution of one who understands the fragility of new life. With infinite care, it touched the baby's little hand with its muzzle, a gesture of welcome that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. John and Rose watched from the porch of the now completely restored house, their hands intertwined, like teenagers. Their children ran through the fields with other village children, their laughter echoing like bells. The farm had become an informal community center, where people gathered to share not only work, but life. Community gardens flourished where there had once been only weeds. and a small organic farmers market took place every Saturday, attracting visitors from all over the region. Mrs. Concepcion, now the farm's official veterinarian despite her retirement, had set up a makeshift clinic where she treated the region's animals free of charge. Young apprentices followed her like chicks, absorbing decades of wisdom. Among them was John's oldest son, who had discovered his vocation in veterinary medicine. The cycle of life continued, each generation planting seeds for the next. It was during the one-year-old party for Hope Jr., as they had named Mary's daughter, that the complete transformation became evident. The small village of St. Mary's had gained regional fame as an example of a united community. Journalists came to document the story of the farm that had been reborn from the ashes. Academics studied the model of sustainable and community agriculture that had emerged organically. But for Mary, the real miracle was in the small details. It was in the way Courage gently guided the younger calves, teaching them with infinite patience. It was in the shine in John's eyes when he talked about plans for the future. It was in the intertwined hands of couples who had met during the work bees. It was in each sunrise that was no longer greeted with laments, but with joyful moos and the sound of a community awakening to another day of shared purpose. Sitting under the shade of the oak tree where she had married, Mary watched her daughter take her first wobbly steps towards Courage. The bull, with the same gentleness it had shown since it was a calf, lowered its head so the girl could pet its fur. Peter captured the moment with a camera, but Mary knew that no photograph could capture the depth of that moment. It was the closing of a circle that had begun with despair and ended with fullness. The afternoon fell golden over the fields, dyeing everything in shades of honey and promise. Somewhere in the distance, Hope mooed, calling her second offspring, a sturdy calf that promised to be as special as Courage. The wind carried the scent of fertile earth and fresh grass, mixed with the aroma of bread baking in the community oven they had built. Mary closed her eyes and let all her senses absorb that moment of perfect peace. When she opened them again, she met Peter's gaze. In it was the same silent question she carried in her chest. They had built something beautiful there, but the world was vast and there were other places needing the same transformative touch. Other laments waiting to be heard, other communities waiting to be awakened. The seed had been planted in St. Mary's, but it was time to let the wind carry it to new fields. The decision wasn't made lightly. There were nights of conversation under the stars, consultations with John and Rose, tears at the thought of leaving behind what they had built. But Courage, as always, provided the answer. On a cloudy morning, the bull guided them to a part of the farm they rarely visited. There, half hidden by vegetation, was an old wagon that John's grandfather had used to explore those lands decades ago. Peter and Mary looked at each other and knew. They weren't abandoning St. Mary's. They were expanding their reach. With the community's blessing and promises of frequent visits, they began to plan. The idea was simple but powerful, to create a network of community farms, each a beacon of hope in its region. They would take with them the lessons learned, the techniques developed, but above all, the certainty that no lament should echo unanswered. The farewell was bittersweet. The entire village gathered for what they called the sowing festival. Gifts were exchanged, hugs that seemed to want to keep a piece of each person. Courage, as if it understood, remained close throughout the celebration. When the time came to leave, the bull did something that surprised everyone. It walked to the restored wagon and touched it with its muzzle, then turned to Mary and Peter with that look that had started it all. It was a blessing, a gentle push towards the future. As the wagon pulled away down the dusty road, Mary looked back one last time. The Miller farm shone under the morning sun like a jewel. She could see the tiny figures of everyone she loved waving from the doorway. Courage was in front, its strong and protective silhouette forever etched in her memory. Hope Jr. slept in her arms, unaware that she was about to become part of something bigger than a single farm or village. Peter held her free hand, squeezing it gently 3 times, his silent code for, "I love you." Mary returned the gesture and turned her face to the road ahead. There were fields waiting, dormant communities ready to awaken, silent laments yearning to transform into songs. The journey would be long and not always easy, but she carried with her the unshakable certainty that where there was compassion and courage, there would be transformation. The sun rose in the clear sky as they drove away, but Mary could swear. She still heard, carried by the wind, the strong and hopeful moo of courage. It was no longer a lament, it was a call. A reminder that in every abandoned field there was potential for rebirth. In every hardened heart there was room for love. In every fragmented community there was the possibility of unity. The Miller farm had only been the beginning. And you? At what point will you let hope bloom in your desert?